Hey everybody, we're here to talk about Act 2 of Much Ado About Nothing. So we're just going to dive right in. As a recap from Act 1, we met all of our characters, particularly Beatrice and Benedict, and we saw their relationship. We got to meet Hero and Claudio, and then we also got to see what was going on with Don John and Don Pedro as well. And we know that that's kind of a fraught relationship. We talked about the issues with social status that are happening there, that Don John is a bastard, that he is born out of wedlock, and that affects his social status. We remember that he tells us that he's a plain dealing villain, that he is not interested in dissembling or being what he is not supposed to be. So we saw at the end of Act 1 that he had decided that he was going to subvert or make problems for Claudio. And so we're going to kind of see what happens with that. So we have specific discussion questions that you guys had and looked at. And so we're going to kind of go through with that. But one of the things to note about Act 2 is that it's very episodic. So there are lots of little, almost like vignettes that happen throughout this act. And so you'll notice even in the stage directions, it talks about characters like coming to the forefront of the stage and then kind of moving back. This is a party scene, especially in Act 2, Scene 1. And so with that, we get lots of different characters that are always on the stage, but then we are asked as the audience to focus on, the specific characters that have come to the fore and that are speaking to us. As we start this act, as we start Act 2, the first question asks us, what are Beatrice's reasons for not wanting to have anything to do with men? What are Leonardo's instructions to his daughter, Hero? And what do these show about traditional attitudes? And so what we notice in Act 2, Scene 1, especially as we are, before we're going into the party, we get Beatrice talking about why she doesn't want to marry. And so she says around line 35, he that hath a beard is more than a youth, and he that hath no beard is less than a man, and he that is more than a youth is not for me, and he that is less than a man is I am not for him. And so she talks about how that she doesn't want to also get married. This is around line 60. She says that she won't marry until God make men of some other metal than earth. She says, would it not, and this is a pretty significant quote, would it not grieve a woman to be overmastered with a piece of valiant dust? And she also then says, Adam's sons are my brethren, and truly I hold a descent to match in my kindred. So one of the things that we should notice is a lot like Benedict in Act 1, her reasons for not wanting to marry, her reasons are not really reasons. They feel like more like excuses, and they're not meant to be taken seriously. The other thing that we should note too is with this, we have Leonardo, who in direct contrast is telling Hero that you know what you should say. We practiced your answer if the prince should ask for your hand. And so Beatrice, with this kind of more modern sensibility, or what we think of as a more modern sensibility, looks at her father and says, yes, or excuse me, looks at her at her cousin and says, yes, faith, it is my cousin's duty to make curtsy and say, Father, as it please you. But yet for all that, cousin, let him be a handsome fellow, or else make another curtsy and say, Father, as it please me. So as we're looking at that, one of the things that we notice is that she is exhorting Hero to make her own choices, right? And to choose a husband that she actually likes instead of one that her father has chosen for her. And so again, like I said, that seems like a more modern sensibility. One of the things that I want to make sure that we realize, it's a very easy and oversimplified reading to say like, oh, Beatrice hates men. She doesn't want to get married because she hates men. And that's not what's happening. I'd like to direct your attention actually to, also in Act 1, Act 2, Scene 1, around line 43, after she has just told Leonardo and the rest of her family, if he that has a beard is more than a man, and so I'm not for him, all of those things. So around line 43, Leonardo basically says, well, what are you going to do? He says, well, then go you into hell, like, right? That's your only other option if you're not going to get married. And she says, no, but to the gate, and there will the devil meet me like an old cuckold with horns on his head and say, get you to heaven, Beatrice, get you to heaven. Here's no place for you maids. So deliver I up my apes and away to St. Peter for the heavens. He shows me where the bachelors sit, and there we live as merry as the day is long. And so what we see here is that she is not saying that she hates men. In fact, she says her idea of heaven is basically hanging out with the bachelors all day long. And so what we see here is that she appreciates that kind of merriment. She appreciates that kind of conversation. And this should kind of help us understand what the attraction is for her and for Benedict, right? Because she appreciates the fact that Benedict speaks to her like a person, right? And wants to like have a conversation with her, even if it is this kind of like barbed kind of jesting. He still wants to talk to her, right? To have this conversation. He doesn't treat her as an object or like a thing to be won. And so that is something, that kind of friendship is something, that kind of relationship, like personal relationship, is something that we see that Beatrice really appreciates. So we are going to leave them there, and we are going to kind of move into to question 2, because question 2 asks us about the dance, which is the next part of this scene. And this is what I was talking about when we have characters kind of moving backwards and forwards. So as the dance starts, it tells us very specifically in the stage directions that Don John is not masked during the revels, and asks us to consider why that might be. And then it also asks us to look at Don John's initial plan for spoiling the match between Hero and Claudio. So we see him come in, and like it says, he is unmasked. And so if we flip, we're going to kind of move back and forth in this scene a little bit. If we take a look around line 155, Don John and Baraccio have come in. They've been kind of observing everything. And Baraccio says to Don John, that's Claudio. I know him by his bearing. And Don John's like, great, here's my chance. And Don John says to Claudio, are you not Signor Benedick? And so we know that he is kind of using this purposeful misdirection. Don John knows that's not Benedict. He knows that it's Claudio. He wants to address Claudio as if he's Benedict to tell him this secret. And here's what the secret is. Don John says to Claudio in the form of Benedict, or in the mistaken identity of Benedict, he says, Signor, you are very near my brother in his love. He is enamored on Hero. I pray you dissuade him from her. She is no equal for his birth. You may do the part of an honest man in it. And so Claudio says, how knows you he loves her? And Don John says, I heard him swear his affection. And Baraccio says, so did I too. And he swore he would marry her tonight. And that's what gets Claudio. So Don John and Baraccio head off knowing that they've kind of like poisoned Claudio's mind. And the mission is kind of accomplished, right? Because if you look down at like 169, Claudio says, thus answer I in the name of Benedict, but hear these ill news with the ears of Claudio. And I want you to look at the next line 172. He says, "'Tis certain so the prince woos for himself." So Claudio is immediately taken in by this. He immediately believes Don John, even though he has no reason to. So he says, friendship is constant in all other things, save in the office and affairs of love. He says, trust no agent, for beauty is a witch. And so isn't that interesting, right? That he is basically blaming Hero's beauty for his friend's kind of infidelity. So we've got Don John, who is in many ways kind of ruining or attempting to ruin 2 relationships here, right? Because he's, of course, ruining the relationship between Claudio and Hero, but he's also trying to ruin the relationship between Claudio and Don Pedro, right? The other thing about him being unmasked, what's really interesting as we look at this scene is we have a lot of characters in this scene who are masked, right? Their faces are hidden, but they are speaking things that are true, right? Don John is the opposite. He is unmasked, but he is speaking things that are false. And so that's that really kind of interesting irony that we want to look at. Like I said, we're going to move back and forth in this scene a little bit. looking back around line 85, one of the things I want to point out to you from line 85 to about line 122 is we have all of these couples, and we're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but as the dance starts, we have all of these couples who kind of come in and out of our frame, right? They come to the front of the stage, they have some lines, and they move to the back of the stage. So we have Benedict and Margaret, we have Balthazar and Margaret, we have Ursula and Antonio, and then we end up with Beatrice and Benedict. Before we get to Beatrice and Benedict, if you take a look at all of those other couplings or all those other pairings in lines 85 to 122, the tone of all of these conversations is very like joyful and flirtatious, right? Like this is supposed to be a fun event. And so these characters and these couplings are like reflecting that. And so we get this contrast when we finally get to Beatrice and Benedict. Because the exchange they have is maybe not quite as joyful or flirtatious. It's a lot more critical, right? Because Beatrice kind of heaps some scorn on Benedict. She says, when they begin talking, and again, remember they're both masked. Beatrice says, "Tell me who told you so. Tell me who told you this. Told you that I was disdainful, and that I had my good wit out of the 100 merry tales." And so the idea that she is disdainful and that she doesn't think of her own insults, right? That she's unoriginal. And for Beatrice, that is not true. And she is very offended by this. And she says, "It must have been Senior Benedict that told you this." And so Benedict kind of goes fishing. He's like, "Oh, what's he? Who's Benedict? Tell me about him." And so she does. So Beatrice tells this masked man, who she does not realize is Benedict, purportedly, that, "Oh, he is the prince's jester, a very dull fool. His only gift is in devising impossible slanders. None but libertines delight in him, and the commendation is not in his wit, but in his villainy, for he both pleases men and angers them." And then they laugh at him and beat him, right? So Benedict gets a little bit bent out of shape about this. And so the third question asks us to think about whether they know each other when they're having this conversation. And so we know from a little bit later on in the play that Benedict knows that it's Beatrice. But what we don't know is if Beatrice knows that it's Benedict, right? So this is a place where we would want to think about how this is actually presented to us on the stage, right? Because every director and every actor is going to present this maybe a little bit differently, whether they know each other or not, and how that affects like the relationship that's being visually portrayed to us. So as we continue to move along through this scene, we have kind of going back to this, right around, or, kind of back past this and past Claudio going, "Woe is me, hero is no longer mine." We have Benedict coming back in and looking at Claudio and saying, that you should basically like be happy, right? Around line 189 and 190, Benedict says to Claudio, "The prince hath got your hero." And Claudio replies, "I wish him joy of her." And so we can see that Claudio, of course, is still believing that the prince is wooed for himself and not for Claudio. And so Benedict is very confused about this. He says, "Did you think the prince would have served you thus?" And Claudio, because he is upset, kind of storms off. He says, "If you will not be, I will leave you." And so off he runs. And Benedict is like, "What is happening?" And so when the prince, after that, the prince and Hero and Leonardo come in, and they're asking, "Where's Claudio?" And Benedict's like, "I don't know. He just ran off. I don't know what's wrong with him." But they ask about basically like, "Are you having a good time at the dance, at the revels?" And so the prince, at one point around line 233, says to Benedict, "The lady Beatrice hath a quarrel with you. The gentleman that danced with her," haha, which was Benedict, "told her she is much wronged by you." And Benedict is like, "What? No, she's the one who insulted me. She says she misused me past the endurance of a block." And so this leads us to question 4. How does Benedict feel about his conversation with Beatrice? And then as we move through this, we're going to talk about the second part of the question, the significance about Beatrice's statement that once before he, meaning Benedict, won it, meaning his heart or her heart, of me with false dice. So let's talk first about how Benedict reacts and how Benedict describes his his conversation with Beatrice. So again, this is around 235, and so we're actually going to take a look at the text for this.
Okay, so we're looking here at line 235 onward, and we're considering the way that Benedict talks about his conversation with Beatrice. So there's a couple things I want to point out. He speaks, of course, with a lot of emotion and passion with this. So he says she speaks poignards, and every word stabs. If her breath were as terrible as her terminations, there were no living near her. She would infect to the North Star. She would have made Hercules have turned spit. She would have cleft his club to make fire. I want you guys to notice all of the exaggerations that are happening here, right? The fact that her words become daggers, that her breath becomes basically an infection or a disease, that she would overcome Adam and Hercules as well. And he ends here by saying, and I want us to look at this particular sentence. He says, "So indeed, I'll disquiet, horror, and perturbation follows her." So I want you to think about all of these insults, right? Like that everything about Beatrice creates disquiet, horror, and perturbation. And remember, he's saying this because she was mean to him, because she said that he was not as funny as he thought he was. And a lot of this exaggeration and this hyperbolic description of Beatrice's like negative qualities in Benedict's eyes, a lot of this is because he cares what she thinks, right? Like he's worked up because he cares what she thinks about him. And this is one of the reasons why he's so upset. So this moment he has just said, "All disquiet, horror, and perturbation follows her." And then she enter Claudio and Beatrice. And the prince says, "Look, here she comes." And Benedict goes on to say, "Will your grace command me any service to the world's end?" And I want you to notice all of these allusions that happen here. "I will go on the slightest errand now to the Antipodes that you can devise to send me on. I will fetch you a toothpicker from the furthest inch of Asia, bring you the length of Prester John's foot, fetch you a hair off the great Cham's beard, do you any embassage to the pygmies, rather than hold 3 words conference with this harpy." So again, these allusions, you don't have to know particularly what these are. You get the effect of them, even if you are reading, that these are all impossible tasks, right? That he'll go as far as the Antipodes or Asia, or he'll go and see these kind of like mythical creatures, right? And go all the way out to the pygmies. He would rather do any of these things than speak 3 words with Beatrice. And notice again what he calls Beatrice. He calls her a harpy. And if you are using a text that has kind of side notes or end notes, when we're looking at the definition of a harpy, it's a monstrous mythological creature with the face and breasts of a woman and the wings and talons of a bird. So he's literally made her into a monster because she said he wasn't funny. And so he asks the prince again, "You have no employment for me?" And the prince says, "None but to desire your good company." So the prince, you can kind of feel him laughing here, like, "Look, here she comes. Nope, I don't have anything else for you to do except to desire you to stay here with me." So he can kind of laugh at them. And Benedict says, "Oh God, sir, here's a dish I love not. I cannot endure my lady tongue." As we look kind of at the end of this, I want to look at the second part of the question, right? The idea that the prince says to Beatrice, "Come, lady, come, you have lost the heart of Signor Benedict," right? And so Beatrice, in this little section right here, gives us this kind of really interesting hint as to what's going on or what has gone on with them in the past, right? She says, "Indeed, my lord, he lent it me a while," talking about the heart of Signor Benedict. "He lent it me a while, and I gave him use for it, a double heart for his single one," right? So this makes us, this mention of like hearts, right? That there's been this previous kind of love relationship. And she says, even once before he won it of me with false dice, right? He won my heart with false dice. And so that comparison, this idea of like love as a game or love as a gamble, and this idea particularly too, not just dice, but false dice, right? That there's this, this idea of like deceit or dishonesty or broken promises that go along with this. And so she says, therefore, your grace may well say, I have lost it. And so the prince reminds her, she says, you have put him down, lady, you have put him down. And Beatrice replies, so I would not he should do me, my lord, right? So the idea that she has preemptively kind of hurt him in order to protect herself so that he should not put her down.
So that brings us to our fifth question. And so the fifth question asks us to think about Don Pedro's plans for romance for Claudio and for Benedict, why these plans work, and also to think about the relationship between Don Pedro and Beatrice as is evidenced through their conversations, and what is interesting and significant about that. So I kind of want to flip these questions, and I want to think about the relationship between Don Pedro and Beatrice before we go a whole lot further. So again, we're still in Act 2, Scene 1. This is quite the scene. And so we are around, let's see, we're around line 285. And so Beatrice has come back in, and this is when she's just finished talking about how, she's put Benedict down so that he wouldn't put her down or he wouldn't hurt her. And so she tells Don Pedro that she has brought Claudio, and they're like, why are you so angry, right? Because the prince says, are you sad? And Claudio says, not sad. And he says, are you sick? And Claudio says, neither, my lord. He's being all like stoic and weird. And Beatrice notes this. She says, the count is neither sad nor sick, nor merry, nor well, but civil, count, civil as an orange, and something of that jealous complexion. And so one of the things that we need to know is that we think of green, right, as the color of jealousy, but that was something more with like that went along the lines of like orange is the color that's representative, or like the kind of this yellowy color. And so that's what Beatrice has kind of picked up on, that like Claudio thinks something is wrong here. And so the prince clears up any confusion immediately, right? Like he does not waste any time. He says in line 292, here, Claudio, I have wooed in thy name, and fair hero is won. And so that clears up and kind of clears away Don John's, plan that he thought was going to work, and that kind of did work, but it clears that away. It clears up that conflict. Everything is happy. Although I will point out to you that Claudio and Hero have never had a conversation that we have seen. Certainly not on stage, not in front of us. So they're getting married, and we've never seen them even converse. So there's that. But as we're moving through that, like, there's this little like, oh, moment where everyone is happy. And Beatrice, they're joking about, stop his mouth with a kiss. And Beatrice kind of says at the end, like, good Lord for alliance. We're around line 311. There thus goes everyone to the world but I, and I am sunburnt. I may sit in a corner and cry, hey ho, for a husband. So she's in this kind of joking way, like saying like everybody's getting married but me. And this is a really interesting point. This is where we're going to look for a second at Don Pedro and Beatrice and their conversation, because the prince says Don Pedro says to Beatrice, he says, Lady Beatrice, I will get you one, meaning a husband. And Beatrice says, I would rather have one of your father's getting, meaning like begetting, like one that your father produced. So it's, of course, this kind of compliment to Don Pedro and to his family, right? Like, I would love to marry into your family. And she jokingly says, hath your grace ne'er a brother like you? Your father got excellent husbands, if a maid could come by them. And I want you to look at line 319, because this gets overlooked really easily. But Don Pedro says to Beatrice, will you have me, lady? So this is a marriage proposal, right? Like, Don Pedro is proposing to Beatrice, which is kind of a big deal, right? Like, this is the prince. This is Don Pedro. He's in charge. He's aristocratic, right? Like, that's why Claudio wants him to be the one to woo Hero. And so he is like, why don't you marry me, Beatrice? And so she turns him down. But she does it in this really kind of lovely and gentle way, and in a very Beatrice kind of way, where she is, gentle and yet funny, and is able to like take the sting out of her rejection by being so like humorous and kind. So she says, No, my lord, unless I might have another for working days. Your grace is too costly to wear every day. So she's like letting him know that it's not him, right? Like, your grace is too costly to wear every day. That, like, what she is concerned with is this idea of like costliness, right? Like that the aristocratic kind of obligations that would come with marrying him are not something that she can do, right? So the problem is not with him, but with his position. And so she says, but I beseech your grace, pardon me. I was born to speak all mirth and no matter. And he says, it's fine. To be merry becomes you. And so she's like, okay. And off she goes. She heads out, and the prince, is not insulted in any way. When she leaves, the first thing he says is, by my troth, a pleasant spirited lady. So once she leaves and Benedict is gone, and it's just Don Pedro and Leonardo and Claudio and Hero on stage, we have Don Pedro, who kind of comes up with this plan. Because Claudio's like, let's get married tomorrow. And Leonardo's like, I'm sorry, no, you can't do that. And so the prince says, or the Don Pedro says, that I'll find something to keep us occupied. He says, in the interim, we'll undertake one of Hercules's labors, which is to bring Signor Benedict and the Lady Beatrice into a mountain of affection, the one with the other. So he says, we'll figure it out. We'll figure out a way to get them together, and that will keep us occupied until your wedding. And so everybody agrees. And at the end, he talks about how that he thinks they can do this, and he conflates them with these kind of, again, mythological kind of gods and kind of heroes. So like I said, like he talks about how this is one of the labors of Hercules, and then he says, if we can do this, Cupid is no longer an archer. His glory shall be ours, for we are the only love gods. So again, it hyperbolizes the task that they have ahead of them, but it also kind of like elevates them as well to like the status of gods if they can pull this off and bring Beatrice and Benedict together. So there is not a question about Act 2, Scene 2, but I do want to take a moment and I want to look at that. And we're going to go back to the text to look at Act 2, Scene 2.
So here we are in Act 2, Scene 2. And so we can see that Don John, of course, is angry about it. He says, it is so, the Count Claudio should marry the daughter of Leonardo. And he says, any bar, any cross, any impediment, so of course we have that parallel structure, will be medicinable to me. I am sick in displeasure to him. And so he asks Borachio how he can make this happen. And so as we read, Borachio tells us about how he's in the favor of Margaret, who is the gentlewoman to Hero. And so Borachio says, this will help because I can, at any unseasonable instant of the night, appoint her to look out of her lady's chamber. And so Don John was like, okay, great. What's going on with that? And they compare this plan to poison, right? The poison of that lies in you to temper. And so he says, go you to the prince your brother, spare not to tell him that he hath wronged in his honor in marrying the renowned Claudio, whose estimation you mightily hold up, to a contaminated stale, such a one as Hero. So we have this huge insult here, right? By calling her a contaminated stale, right? Somebody who is unchaste, somebody who has been quote unquote contaminated. And Don John knows enough here where he says, what proof shall I make of that? He knows that that Claudio and the rest of them are not going to believe this about Hero for a couple reasons. First of all, because her reputation doesn't hold that up, right? And also because, he's already kind of tried to trick Claudio and it hasn't worked, right? So he knows he's going to need this idea of proof. So here is Borachio giving the plan. He says, tell them, Don Pedro and the Count Claudio, tell them that Hero loves me. And so he says, they will scarcely believe this without trial, so offer them instances. And so he says, here's what we'll do. We'll have them see me at her chamber window, hear me call Margaret Hero, hear Margaret term me Claudio, and bring them to see this the very night before the intended wedding. For in the meantime, I will so fashion the matter that Hero shall be absent, and there shall appear such seeming truth of Hero's disloyalty that jealousy will be called assurance, and all the preparation overthrown. So his plan is to, Borachio's plan, and Borachio is again one of Don John's henchmen, is to have Hero out of the way, right? She'll be absent, and for her lady in waiting Margaret to be at the window, and he's going to call her Hero. And so like she'll also call Borachio Claudio, and that is a thing that's a little harder to explain, especially on a video. But Claudio will know that it's not him because he will be watching. But basically, they're going to trick Claudio into seeing Borachio and Margaret together in Hero's chamber. And to be in an intimate kind of setting and situation, and that is what's going to prove that that Hero has been unfaithful. And so Don John agrees to this. And it's interesting, too, again, that they understand that they need this proof, right? That this cannot be just something that is hearsay, right? That's no longer enough for it to be just kind of this auditory hearsay, but it has to be this visual proof in order for this plan to work. And so here is the plan that Borachio has come up with. And Don John likes it so well that he promises to pay Borachio if it works.
Okay, last question and last section. So we are in Act 2, Scene 3. And so we're going to be looking at this final scene with Benedict in the garden. So Benedict is in the garden, and he is, this is where kind of Don Pedro and Leonardo and Claudio put their plan into motion to trick Benedict. And so they know that Benedict is out in the garden, and so we get to see Benedict kind of talking to himself and giving this soliloquy at the start of this particular scene. So around line 25, he's talking about how he can't believe that Claudia wants to get married. That he he says that I've known when there was no music in him but the drum and fife. He was wont to speak plain and to the purpose, and now he is all kinds of lovesick. And so Benedict, after kind of lamenting what's going on with Claudio, he says, may I be so converted and see with these eyes? And he says, nope, that will never happen. He says, one woman is fair, yet I am well. Another is wise, yet I am well. Another virtuous, yet I am well. But till all graces be in one woman, and one woman shall not come in my grace. So basically he's saying that all of the woman that he would want to marry would have to have all of those kind of traits, right? Like fair and wise and virtuous and graceful, like all of that has to happen in order for him to even be interested. And so he goes on after that around line 30, and he uses this same kind of parallel structure to, again, talk about more of the traits that he would expect to have in his ideal woman, right? This is what he's describing for us around line 30. He says, rich she shall be, that's certain, wise or I'll none, virtuous or I'll never cheapen her, fair or I'll never look on her, mild or come not near me, noble or not I for an angel, of good discourse, an excellent musician, her hair shall be of whatever color God it please God, right? So he's saying that she has to have all of these different qualities, right? Like she has to be all of these things, but the color of her hair, that doesn't matter. He doesn't care about that. It's the one thing he's not interested in. Of whatever color it should be, please God. And so after he's spent this time kind of describing to the audience what his ideal woman would be like, he's like, oh no, here comes the prince and Claudio and Leonardo. In fact, he says, the prince and Monsieur Love. So we know he's talking about Claudio. So Leonardo and the prince, Don Pedro, and everybody comes into the garden, and they know that Benedict is there. And so they have this kind of song. We talked a little bit earlier about how this is a play that's aware of its own theatricality. And so this is one of the places where we see them kind of burst into song in the middle of the play. And so as this is going on, once we get to, after the song, around line 95, this is where we start to see Don Pedro and Leonardo and Claudio putting the plan into motion. And so Don Pedro says very loudly, "Come hither, Leonardo. What was it you told me of today? That your niece Beatrice was in love with Signor Benedict?" Um, and so Benedict, I want you guys to pay attention to all of the stage directions here, because you'll notice that there's a lot of asides, right, where the stage direction says aside. And so that is to let us know who is speaking to whom, because we have to keep track of that. And so Benedict says in line 105 as an aside, "Is it possible?" Right? So we know that he's kind of talking to himself, and we as the audience know this. As we move through this scene, we have Claudio in an aside to Leonardo around line 116. He says, "Bait the hook well, this fish will bite," talking about Benedict. And so he talks about all of the different effects, right, of love that Beatrice is going through. And Benedict around line 125 says, "I should think this is a gull or a trick, but that the white-bearded fellow speaks it. Knavery cannot sure hide himself in such reverence." So Benedict is saying, like, I think this was a trick, except Leonardo was saying it, and everybody knows that old people don't lie. So as they continue to move through, some of the things that they say about Beatrice. They say, Leonardo says that Hero has presented him with this piece of paper that has like Beatrice and Benedict written all over it, like she's like some sort of like lovesick middle schooler. And Leonardo around line 145, 150 says, "Oh, she tore the letter into 1,000 pieces, railed at herself that she should be so immodest to write one, that she would write that down." Claudio in 154 goes even farther, and he says, "Then down upon her knees she falls, weeps, sobs, beats her breast, tears her hair, prays, curses. Um, oh, sweet Benedict, God give me patience." And Leonardo builds even farther upon that in line like 157. He says, "My daughter," meaning Hero, "is sometimes afeared that Beatrice will do a desperate outrage to herself." Does this sound like the Beatrice that we have gotten to know in the past couple acts? Probably not. I think not. I think this exaggeration is so overdone. So why does Benedict believe it? Why does he believe this? He believes it because he wants to believe it, right? He wants to believe that Beatrice is in love with him. And so this makes it easier for him to do that. And so around around line 200, like they're like, "Well, what should we do? Should we tell Benedict?" And they're like, "No, we shouldn't tell him because he would just make fun of her, and we don't want that. We don't want, Beatrice to be embarrassed." And so Claudio says in line 204 and 205, "Never tell him, my lord. Let her wear it out with good counsel," right? Like, let it lie. She'll get over it. That's better than, Benedict like making fun of her about this. And so they kind of walk off together, and the prince, or Don Pedro, says to Leonardo, "Let there be the same net spread for her," meaning Beatrice. And so after they leave, or around line 221, as they're walking out, we get Don Pedro who says, "Let us send her to call him into dinner," right? Like, let's send Beatrice out to Benedict after we've just done this thing and got him kind of like all whipped up about her being in love with him. And so this is this really great scene where we have Benedict kind of realizing that he is okay with being in love with Beatrice. And so we're going to look at this. This is around line 223, and this is another place where we're going to go back to the text.
Okay, so we're at line 223. This is an interesting scene because it's kind of bookended by Benedict's kind of soliloquies, right? And the first one that we talked about at the very beginning of this question was Benedict talking about his ideal woman. And she really was ideal, right? There was not an actual woman who could be all of those things that he listed with that parallel structure. But what's interesting as we look here, especially right here around line 233, they say the lady is fair, 'tis a truth I cannot bear them witness, and virtuous, 'tis so I cannot reprove it, and wise, but for loving me, by my troth it is no addition to her wit, nor no great argument of folly, for I will be horribly in love with her. So notice we have these same words, right? Fair, virtuous, wise. All of these things are things that Benedict listed at the beginning of the scene that now he is listing here about Beatrice, right? So Beatrice, we are seeing this kind of mirroring where he is saying that she does have all of the traits of his ideal woman. When we're looking here at the end, we'll notice all of these kind of rhetorical questions, right? And just like Beatrice had all of these kind of like silly reasons or excuses for not getting married at the beginning, Benedict has ones here that seem silly, and they're to kind of like disprove his earlier statements that he would never marry, right? He says, no, the world must be peopled, right? Like that I have to get married because we have to have children. The world must be peopled. And he also says, when I said I would die a bachelor, I did not think I should live till I were married, right? So he's saying basically like, oh, well, when I said these things, when I made these statements that I would never get married, it was because of circumstances outside my control, but now I can. And so here comes Beatrice, he says, and comments on her fairness. And remember, Beatrice doesn't know at this point that anything has changed but in Benedict's mind. So as we look at this exchange, she says, against my will, I am sent to bid you come in to dinner. And she makes sure to tell him that this is against her will. And so suddenly he says, fair Beatrice, I thank you for your pains. And I feel like we can kind of feel her confusion here. She says, I took no more pains for those things than you took pains to thank me, right? Like, I don't know why you're thanking me because I didn't do anything to be thankful for. And so she continues and said, if it had been painful, I wouldn't have come. And he says, oh, you take pleasure then in the message, right? And so she says, yes, just so much as you would take upon a knife's point. And so she says, you have no stomach, Signor? Fare you well. Basically, if you're not going to come in, goodbye. And so this is one of my favorite lines here where he says, against my will, I am sent to bid you come into dinner. So he's repeating her here. And he says, there's a double meaning in that. And so this is where we end kind of our examination of this.